The telegram arrived at the county courthouse on November 3rd, 1889, at precisely 2:47 in the afternoon. Sheriff Hank Mercer, age 51, stood in his office reading the same 5 words over and over. He died 3 weeks ago. The he in question was sitting in Mercer's jail cell at that very moment, breathing, eating, speaking. The man had been arrested 2 days prior for trespassing on the old Wickham property, a routine matter that should have resulted in a fine and release, except the suspect had given his name as Thomas Wickham, and Thomas Wickham, according to official records from the state capitol, had been declared dead and buried on October 12th, 1889. Mercer walked to the cell. The man inside looked up with pale, steady eyes. "I told you who I was," he said quietly. "I told you from the start." What happened next would become the most documented case of unexplained identity in Montana Territory history, a case where the living and the dead occupied the same space, where official records contradicted physical reality, where a small-town sheriff found himself enforcing laws that didn't account for the impossible. This is the story of the week. Hank Mercer arrested a dead man, and what it cost him to prove he was right. But like all good mysteries, we need to start not at the end, but at the beginning, before the chaos, before the questions, back when Mercer's world still made sense. Silver Bow County, Montana Territory, 1889, population 1,247 souls, give or take a dozen transients passing through on their way to somewhere more promising. The town of Meridian sat in a valley between 2 low ridges of pine and granite, connected to the rest of civilization by a single dirt road that turned to soup every spring and dust every summer. Sheriff Hank Mercer had held his position for 11 years, not because he was particularly ambitious. Mercer had never been that, but because he was competent, fair, and crucially, willing to stay. Men with talent left for Helena or Butte. Men with ambition chased Silver Strikes. Mercer stayed because Meridian was simple, predictable, safe. He was a widower, his wife, Caroline, having passed from pneumonia in the winter of '83. No children. His life had contracted to a tight routine. Mornings at the office, afternoons walking the town's 3 main streets, evenings at the boarding house where Mrs. Halloran kept a room for him and served dinner at 6 sharp. Mercer was tall, lean, with gray threading through his dark hair and deep lines around his eyes, the kind earned from squinting into sun and distance rather than worry. He carried a Colt revolver he'd drawn exactly twice in 11 years, both times to put down injured animals. Violence was rare in Meridian. Most of his work involved settling property disputes, tracking down stolen livestock, and occasionally escorting drunks home from the saloon. The Wickham property sat 3 miles east of town, accessible by a winding trail that most residents avoided. It had been abandoned for nearly 2 years, ever since old Gerald Wickham died, and his son Thomas left for parts unknown. The house, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and fading white paint, had fallen into disrepair. Locals said it was haunted, but locals said that about every empty building. Mercer didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in facts, in documentation, in the solid, provable world. That belief would be tested on the afternoon of November 1st, 1889, when Deputy Jim Farrow came running into his office with news that someone was squatting in the Wickham house. "Saw smoke from the chimney," Farrow reported, breathless. "Went up to check. There's a man inside, Sheriff. Says he owns the place." Mercer sighed, reached for his hat. "Probably some drifter. We'll sort it out." The ride to the Wickham property took 40 minutes. Mercer had been inside the house only once before, years ago, when Gerald Wickham reported a break-in that turned out to be raccoons in the attic. He remembered it as dark, cluttered, filled with the accumulated possessions of a man who never threw anything away. Now, approaching on horseback, Mercer saw fresh repairs. The porch had been mended, new glass in a previously broken window, Firewood stacked neatly beside the door. Someone was living here. Had been for at least a few days. Mercer dismounted, knocked on the door. Footsteps inside. Then it opened, and a man stood in the doorway, mid-30s, average height, with brown hair and unremarkable features, the kind of face you'd forget in a crowd. "Sheriff," the man said, as if he'd been expecting company. "I'm going to need you to explain what you're doing here," Mercer said. The man stepped back, gestured inside. "Come in, I'll make coffee." And that should have been the end of it. A simple trespassing case. Except when Mercer asked for identification, the man reached into his coat and produced papers, old, worn, but clearly official, that identified him as Thomas Gerald Wickham, born 1854, sole heir to the Wickham estate. "You're Thomas Wickham?" Mercer asked carefully. "Yes, sir." "Can you prove that?" The man walked to a desk, opened a drawer, pulled out a leather folder. Inside, deeds, letters, photographs. A family Bible with names and dates inscribed in fading ink. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. This man was who he claimed to be. "Where have you been for 2 years?" Mercer asked. "California, working. I came back when I heard my father passed." It all seemed reasonable, plausible. Except for one thing Mercer couldn't quite articulate, a feeling, instinctive and uncomfortable, that something was wrong. Not with the story, with the man himself, the way he moved, the way his eyes didn't quite track movement correctly, the unnatural stillness when he stood in one place. Mercer left without making an arrest, rode back to town, filed a report. That night, he couldn't sleep. The next morning, Mercer sent a telegram to the Hall of Records in Helena. Simple request, confirmation of Thomas Wickham's status, current address if available. He expected a response within a week. Bureaucracy moved slowly in the territories. The response came in 18 hours. Thomas Gerald Wickham, born April 3rd, 1854, died October 12th, 1889, buried Laurel Hill Cemetery, San Francisco, California. Cause, typhoid fever. Death certificate on file. Mercer read it 3 times. Checked the date. October 12th. 3 weeks ago. He walked to the window of his office, stared out at the street. A wagon rolled past. Mrs. Chen swept the steps of her laundry. Everything normal. Everything real. Except he'd sat across from Thomas Wickham yesterday, shaken his hand, watched him pour coffee with steady, living hands. Mercer sent a second telegram, this one to the cemetery in San Francisco. He needed more than a date. He needed confirmation, details, something that would make sense of what his instincts were screaming. Then he rode back to the Wickham property. The man was outside, splitting wood. He looked up when Mercer approached, set down the axe. "Sheriff, back so soon?" "I need you to come with me," Mercer said. "I've got some questions that need answering in town." "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet, but I'd appreciate your cooperation." To his surprise, the man didn't argue, simply nodded, went inside to retrieve his coat, and allowed himself to be escorted to Meridian. Mercer installed him in the town's single jail cell, a small room with barred windows and a cot, and locked the door more out of procedure than necessity. "How long are you keeping me?" the man asked. "Until I get some answers." "Answers to what?" Mercer studied him through the bars. "Who you really are." The man sat on the cot, folded his hands. "I already told you." Over the next 24 hours, Mercer interviewed everyone in town who'd known the Wickham family. Margaret Saunders, who'd taught Thomas as a boy, came to the jail and stared at the prisoner for 5 full minutes. "That's him," she said finally. "Older, but that's Thomas. I'd know him anywhere." Reverend Holt, who'd performed Gerald Wickham's funeral, confirmed the same. So did Peter Lassiter, who'd worked alongside Thomas on his father's land 15 years prior. Every person who'd known Thomas Wickham identified the man in the cell as Thomas Wickham. But the telegram from San Francisco was unambiguous. Thomas Wickham was dead, certified by a physician, witnessed by a hospital chaplain, buried with a headstone that bore his name. Mercer barely slept that second night. He kept returning to the cell, staring at the prisoner, looking for some sign of deception. But the man simply sat, reading a book Mercer had provided, occasionally glancing up with those pale, steady eyes. "You don't believe me," the man said during one of these visits. "I don't know what to believe," Mercer admitted. "I'm Thomas Wickham. I came home. That's all there is to it." "Then how do you explain the death certificate?" "I can't." The man closed his book. "Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe someone else died and they recorded the wrong name. Maybe..." He paused. "Maybe some things don't have explanations, Sheriff." That was when the second telegram arrived. The cemetery superintendent in San Francisco was a man named Howard Greaves, and his telegram was detailed, almost defensive in tone. "Thomas G. Wickham interred October 15th, 1889, plot 47B, Laurel Hill. I personally oversaw the burial. Paid for by St. Mary's Hospital Fund for Indigent Deceased. Grave sealed and recorded per municipal regulations." Mercer showed the telegram to Doc Howell, Meridian's physician, who read it twice and shook his head. "Either you've got the wrong man in that cell, Hank, or somebody made a hell of an error in California. Everybody in town who knew Thomas says that's him. Then California buried the wrong man." It was the only explanation that made sense. A misidentification. A bureaucratic error compounded by distance and time. Except Mercer couldn't shake the feeling that the explanation was too simple. Too convenient. He went back to the cell. "Tell me about San Francisco," Mercer said. "What were you doing there?" The man looked up. "Working. Docks, mostly. Loading ships." "For 2 years?" "More or less." "Where'd you live?" "Boarding house on Kearny Street. Mrs. Talbot's place." "You get sick at all? See any doctors?" The man's expression didn't change. "No, why?" "Because according to San Francisco, you died of typhoid fever at St. Mary's Hospital." Silence. The man set down his book, stood, walked to the bars. "Sheriff, I don't know what to tell you. I'm alive. I'm here. Whatever records you've got, they're wrong. You have any proof you were in San Francisco? Letters, pay stubs, witnesses?" "I kept to myself. Didn't make friends. I was saving money to come home." It was perfectly plausible and completely unverifiable. Mercer spent the next day digging through county records, looking for anything, tax documents, property transfers, correspondence, that might establish a timeline. He found a letter dated March 1888, sent from Thomas to his father, postmarked San Francisco. The handwriting matched the signature on the documents the man had shown him. But after March 1888, nothing. No letters, no records. As if Thomas Wickham had simply vanished for 18 months before reappearing in October 1889, the same month he'd allegedly died. Word spread through Meridian. The town was small. Secrets didn't keep. People began gathering outside the jail, peering through windows, whispering. Some said it was a hoax. Others said it was a miracle. A few, like Mrs. Halloran, who attended church faithfully and read omens and weather, said it was a sign that the dead were returning, that judgment was near. Mercer ignored the speculation. He focused on what he could prove. On November 5th, he received a third telegram, this one from a San Francisco police detective named Walsh. "Checked Talbot boarding house per your request. Mrs. Talbot deceased May 1889. Records burned in fire. No tenant lists available. Checked hospital admission logs, St. Mary's. Thomas Wickham admitted October 9th, fever. Died October 12th, 0340 hours. Physician's signature, Dr. Raymond Kepler. Body claimed by hospital for burial. No family present." Mercer read the telegram in his office, alone, the oil lamp flickering on his desk. Every detail corroborated the official story. Admission logs, death certificate, burial records, a chain of documentation that should have been unbreakable, and yet the man in his cell was alive. Mercer walked to the cell one more time. The man was lying on the cot, hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling. "I sent inquiries to San Francisco," Mercer said. "Everything checks out. Hospital records, death certificate, burial. All of it says you died 3 weeks ago." The man turned his head, met Mercer's eyes. "Then maybe I did." The words hung in the air between them. "That's not possible," Mercer said. "Isn't it?" The man sat up slowly. "You've verified I'm Thomas Wickham. Everyone in this town confirms it. But you've also verified Thomas Wickham died in California. Both things are true, Sheriff. Both things are documented. So, what does that make me?" Mercer felt something cold settle in his chest. "You're saying you're—" "I'm not saying anything. I'm telling you what you already know. I came home. That's all. I came home." That night, Mercer didn't go back to the boarding house. He stayed in his office, door locked, going through every document, every telegram, every piece of evidence he'd collected, looking for the crack, the inconsistency, the place where reality had broken. He never found it. By November 7th, news of the case had reached Helena. A territorial marshal named Cordell arrived by coach, accompanied by a clerk from the Attorney General's office. They set up in the courthouse, reviewed Mercer's evidence, interviewed the prisoner. Cordell was a hard man, efficient and skeptical, with no patience for speculation. He spent 3 hours examining the telegrams, the witness statements, the documents from the Wickham house. "It's a con," he concluded. "Has to be. Someone impersonating Wickham. Real Thomas died in California. This man heard about it somehow. Came back to claim the property." "Then explain the witnesses," Mercer said. "Explain how a schoolteacher who knew Thomas as a child identifies him immediately. Memory's unreliable. People see what they expect to see. What about the handwriting? The family Bible? The photographs?" Cordell shrugged. "He's good. Studied his mark. It happens." But when they brought the prisoner out for formal questioning, Cordell's certainty began to waver. The man answered every question with calm precision, described details of his childhood in Meridian that only someone who'd lived there would know. The location of a fishing spot behind the old mill, the name of his father's horse, the pattern of wallpaper in the upstairs bedroom, details Cordell had verified with elderly residents, details that matched perfectly. "Who are you really?" Cordell demanded, leaning across the table. "Thomas Wickham. Thomas Wickham is dead." "Then you've solved your mystery, Marshal." The interview lasted 6 hours and went nowhere. Cordell left frustrated, promising to return with federal authority if necessary. But before he departed, he pulled Mercer aside. "This doesn't make sense," Cordell admitted quietly. "I've worked fraud cases for 15 years. I've seen good imposters. This man? If he's lying, he's the best I've ever seen. And if he's not lying..." He trailed off. "If he's not lying, then what?" Mercer pressed. Cordell looked uncomfortable. "Then we're dealing with something outside my jurisdiction." After the marshal left, Meridian fell into an uneasy tension. The man remained in the cell, neither charged nor released. Mercer fed him, provided books, changed the bedding. The prisoner, because that's what he was, even without formal charges, never complained, never grew agitated. He simply existed, patient and still, as if waiting for something. "What are you waiting for?" Mercer asked one evening. "I'm not sure," the man replied honestly, "but I'll know when it arrives." Mercer sent more telegrams to shipping companies in San Francisco, looking for employment records, to churches, looking for baptismal records, to anyone who might provide one more piece of evidence that would finally resolve the impossible contradiction. Every response confirmed the same two truths. Thomas Wickham had lived in Meridian, and Thomas Wickham had died in San Francisco. On November 10th, something changed. The prisoner woke complaining of cold. Mercer brought extra blankets, but the man's hands trembled as he wrapped them around himself. "You sick?" Mercer asked. No, just cold. But the cell was warm. The stove in the outer office kept the entire building heated. The next day, the prisoner ate nothing, refused food, drank only water. His skin grew pale, not the paleness of illness, but something else, something translucent, as if he were fading. Doc Howell examined him through the bars. The prisoner refused to let anyone enter the cell, and emerged, shaking his head. His pulse is weak, body temperature's low, but he shows no signs of disease. I don't know what's happening to him. Mercer knew. On some level, beneath logic and evidence and reason, he knew. The man was returning to the state he'd left behind in California. On November 12th, the prisoner could no longer stand. He lay on the cot, breathing shallow, eyes half closed. Mercer brought water, which the man sipped weakly. "You're dying," Mercer said. Not a question. "Yes." "What are you?" The man's lips moved. Mercer had to lean close to hear. "I told you, I came home." "But you were already dead." "Death isn't always the end, Sheriff. Sometimes it's just a delay." "That's not possible." A faint smile. "You keep saying that." Mercer left the cell, returned to his office. He sat at his desk, head in hands. Everything he'd built his life on, order, law, the provable world, had crumbled. He'd arrested a dead man, held him in a cell, treated him like any other prisoner, and now that dead man was dying again, and Mercer didn't know whether that made him guilty of murder or mercy. He wrote a letter to the territorial governor, detailed everything, the evidence, the witnesses, the impossible contradiction. He sealed it, addressed it, set it aside. Then he went back to the cell. The prisoner was unconscious, breathing, but barely. His face had taken on a gray quality, flesh sunken, as if decay was finally asserting itself. Mercer unlocked the cell door, the first time he'd entered since the arrest. He sat on the edge of the cot, looked at the dying man. "Why did you come back?" he asked, knowing there would be no answer. "What were you looking for?" The man's eyes flickered open. "Home," he whispered. "Just wanted to see home." And then he stopped breathing. Mercer sat there for a long time, in the silence. Finally he stood, checked for a pulse. Found none. He locked the cell door, walked to his office, and noted the time in his log. November 12th, 1889, 11:17 p.m. Prisoner, deceased. But what had died? A man? A ghost? An impossibility made flesh? Doc Howell came at dawn, examined the body, shook his head. "He's been dead for weeks, Hank. Look at the decomposition. This man's been dead since October 12th, Mercer finished. "How is that possible?" "I don't know. They buried him, in the town cemetery, in an unmarked grave. No one wanted their name associated with the burial. Reverend Holt refused to perform services. The grave was dug by 2 men Mercer paid cash, and they never spoke of it again. Mercer sent his letter to the governor. Never received a response. He sent a telegram to Marshal Cordell. No reply. The Wickham house stood empty. No one claimed it. Eventually, it fell further into ruin, and the town avoided it completely. Hank Mercer served as sheriff for 2 more years. In 1891, at age 53, he resigned. Told no one why. Simply packed his belongings, paid Mrs. Halloran for his final month of rent, and left Meridian on the morning stage. He moved to Wyoming, took a job as a clerk in a land office. Quiet work, predictable, safe. He never spoke about the Thomas Wickham case. When asked why he'd left law enforcement, he'd say only that he'd seen something that made him question his fitness for the job. In 1903, a historian researching territorial crime records came across Mercer's original case file. The documents were there: telegrams, witness statements, the death certificate from San Francisco, the burial record from Meridian. 2 deaths, same man, 3 weeks apart. The historian wrote to Mercer, then living in Cheyenne, asked for clarification. Mercer's response was brief. I arrested a man who claimed to be Thomas Wickham. All evidence confirmed his identity. All evidence also confirmed his death prior to arrest. I do not have an explanation. I no longer seek one. Some things exist outside the law's jurisdiction. The case file remains in Montana's territorial archives, unsolved, unexplained. A footnote in the history of American frontier justice, the sheriff who arrested the dead. But here's what haunts. Not the impossibility, not the contradiction, but the simplicity. A man died far from home. A man came back to see that home one last time. And between those two facts, there's a gap where logic fails and something else begins. Mercer understood that. In his final years, he died in 1918 at 80 years old. He kept a journal. Most entries were mundane. Weather, meals, names of birds he'd seen, but one entry, dated October 12th, 1903, the 14th anniversary of Thomas Wickham's death, contained a single line. Perhaps home is not a place we leave. Perhaps it's a place that holds us, even after we should be gone. We build our lives on certainties, law and order, birth and death, the measurable world. But sometimes, in the spaces between those certainties, something slips through. Something that answers to older laws than the ones we write. Something that reminds us how thin the boundary is between what we know and what we cannot possibly explain. Hank Mercer learned that in a jail cell in Montana, watching a dead man die again. And he spent the rest of his life wondering if the dead could come home, who else might be walking among us? Who else might we pass on the street, serve dinner to, arrest for trespassing, never knowing they'd already crossed a line from which there's supposed to be no return? The Wickham house burned down in 1924. Lightning strike, they said. Nothing remained but the foundation and the chimney. The land was eventually sold, subdivided, built over. But sometimes, locals say, those who know the history, sometimes on October nights, when the air turns cold and the wind moves through the valley just right, you can see a figure standing where the house once stood, just standing, looking, as if finally, truly home.